Emily Harper woke before dawn, her heart light with hope. She had worked as a flight attendant for 3 years now, and she loved the job more each day. When she pulled on her crisp navy uniform and tied her hair back, she felt proud. She paused at the mirror to fix her collar and gave herself a small smile. Beyond her uniform, she was just Amelia, gentle soul, who found joy in small acts of kindness. She packed her bag with care, slipping in her favorite pen, a paperback novel, and a photo of her little brother Mark, smiling on his first day of call as she stepped into the quiet of the Seattle morning and headed for the airport. The roads were empty, the streetlights still glowing gold. Emily breathed deeply of the cool air. She loved this time before the world woke, when she could gather her thoughts and imagine all the good she might do that day. Landing her shift on Flight 472 to Anchorage felt special. It was her first trip of the month to Alaska, a land she had always dreamed of exploring beyond the cabin window, in the crew lounge. She found Captain Reyes and her fellow attendants all preparing for the long day ahead. They shared warm coffee and laughed at childhood stories. Emily liked how the crew cared for each other like family. She ran through the safety checks with calm confidence, smiling at passengers as they arrived. Each face held a story, young children clutching stuffed toys, business travelers with stiff suits, elders clutching prayer beads. Emily took pride in making them feel safe and welcome. Once aboard, she moved through the cabin with quiet grace. She showed passengers how to buckle their seatbelts, demonstrated oxygen masks, and answered every question with warmth. A little boy reached out for the demo mask, and Emily crouched to his level, making silly faces so he would smile. His laugh was bright, and Emily felt her own spirits lift. This simple moment reminded her why she loved the work, giving comfort, easing fears, and brightening lives. At cruising altitude, Emily found a moment alone by the window. She watched the sky soften into pale blue, then white. Thin clouds drifted, like cotton, and mountains peeked through gaps in the mist. She thought of her own mountain of dreams, saving money to rent her own apartment downtown, one with a bright kitchen window where she could grow herbs. She imagined the day she would freeze her first paycheck and mail it to her brother's college fund. She pictured herself volunteering at a children's shelter, wearing old jeans and painting walls in cheerful colors. As the flight neared Anchorage, Emily also felt a thrill of adventure. She had never been to that city before. She planned to step off the plane and feel the crisp northern air. She would walk for blocks, discovering shops that sold handmade crafts and steaming bowls of soup. She thought about calling Sam, her best friend from flight school, and telling her every small detail. Sam had always been her greatest listener. Emily valued their long talks about hopes and fears. The flight landed smoothly in Anchorage. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a soft glow over snow-dusted peaks. Passengers clapped lightly, and Emily gave the captain a respectful nod. She gathered her bag and stepped onto the tarmac, her boots crunching on the cold, hard ground. The air smelled of pine and frost. She zipped up her coat against the chill and looked around at the small cluster of hangars and service vehicles. It felt quiet here, far from the bustle of the city. Emily lifted her phone from her pocket and tapped out a quick message to Sam. "Hi, Sam. Just landed in Anchorage. It's beautiful and cold. I'll call you in the morning. Love him," she slipped the phone back with a contented sigh. In this remote corner of the world, she felt free. She adjusted her scarf and gave a polite wave to the ground crew. They waved back, friendly faces hidden behind wool hats. She was the last crew member to leave the plane. She took one more look up at Flight 472's tail, the airline logo bright against the sky. Then she turned toward the small shuttle that would take her to the crew lounge by the runway office. The path was simpler, narrow gravel road between wooden guideposts. The wind whispered through the pines, and she paused to listen. It was a moment of peace she would always remember. When the minutes passed and Emily did not return, Captain Reyes glanced down the path and frowned. The shuttle driver honked twice, but there was no reply. Inside the cabin, the passengers' luggage had been unloaded, and the next crew waited to board. The ground crew began securing the plane. The shuttle arrived empty. The driver stepped out, saw Emily's footsteps in the dirt, and called her name. His voice sounded small against the vast silence, but Emily was gone. No sign of struggle, no sign of her anywhere. Her scarf lay neatly on a low rail by the guidepost, and her bag rested against a tree trunk, as if she had set it down for a moment of rest. The driver's heart pounded. He looked deeper into the shadows of the forest line. It was dark there, but the snow still glowed faintly. He shouted again and again, but his voice faded into the hush. Inside the runway office, the crew reported, "Emily missing." Phones rang. Local staff hurried to gather search teams, and the airport manager called the state ranger station. Mark, back home in Seattle, was asleep when his phone rang at dawn. He rubbed his eyes and answered, expecting to hear Emily's carefree voice. Instead, a calm stranger said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your sister didn't make it back." To the crew lounge. Mark's world stilled. He pressed his hand to his mouth, fighting for breath. How could Emily simply vanish? He remembered her laughter in their childhood home, her gentle advice when he felt lost. Tried to call her again and again, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He opened the message thread and saw her last text, sent just minutes before. Full of hope, as the sun rose over Seattle, Mark packed a bag and drove toward Anchorage. He held tight to the memory of that text, believing his sister would be safe somewhere, waiting to be found. Emily Harper, he thought, was strong and smart. She could handle anything. He would find her, but deep down, a small fear stirred. In that quiet dawn, as searchlights and canine units prepared to sweep the woods around the airstrip, Mark wondered if the wide sky and cold land had swallowed her whole. He gripped the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead, determined to bring Emily home. Yet he could not know how wrong he would be, or how long it would take to learn the truth. The morning air in Anchorage felt cold and still as the news of Emily's disappearance spread. Rangers formed into small teams, each with a guide and a map of the area. They moved quietly through the scrub and pine trees, their eyes scanning the underbrush for any sign of Emily. Sniffer dogs padded ahead, noses low to the ground, searching for her scent. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made hearts beat faster, but for hours they found nothing. Sunlight slanted through the branches, and the forest seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. At the tiny runway office, Emily's bag and scarf still lay exactly where they had been left. Ground crew members stood in tight circles, talking in hushed tones. One older mechanic shook his head, unable to believe that someone could vanish so completely. The shuttle driver who first saw the abandoned items stared at the trees, wishing he could see past the shadows. Inside, flight crews and airport managers called local law enforcement, hoping for rapid answers. But each call only confirmed that no one had seen Emily since she stepped away. By midday, word reached Seattle. Mark sat at his desk in the small apartment he shared with a friend. He stared at his phone, willing it to ring. Instead, he saw the headline posted on a friend's message board, "Flight attendant missing after Anchorage stop." His chest tightened. He packed a small bag, threw on a coat, and caught a taxi to the airport. Outside his window, city streets buzzed with life, unaware of the grief that raced through him. He told himself he would find Emily, that she would be waiting for him with her bright smile. Back in Anchorage, search teams widened their range. Volunteers from nearby towns joined in. Some wore bright jackets, others carried torches. They formed long lines, sweeping across clearings and climbing low hills. Hunters who knew the forest said the chance of an animal attack was small but possible. Bears roamed these woods, they said, but had learned to stay away from people. Still did. Every team carried bear spray and whistles. Hope flickered and dimmed with each passing hour. Marine biologists and wildlife experts consulted maps of animal trails. One theory suggested Emily had wandered off to follow a strange sound, maybe a bird or a distant howl. Another idea was a slip on a hidden ravine edge where moss covered loose rocks. Some whispered about foul play and opportunist hiding in the trees. Yet no footprints led away from the scene, no evidence of a stranger. It was as if Emily had simply melted into the air. A few hours into the search, a ranger found a small tear in a bush branch. It held a sliver of navy fabric like the uniform Emily wore. Nearby, footprints circled and returned as though someone had paced in confusion. For a moment, hope soared. The team traced the prints deeper into the woods, but they soon faded in soft dirt. The torn patch was the only physical clue. They bagged it and sent it to the station for analysis, but it felt little comfort against the wide emptiness. As evening fell, reporters flocked to the airport perimeter. Cameras trained on the fenced runway, microphones reached through gates. Emily's face filled screens back home, and strangers marched onto search lines, eager to help. News anchors in Seattle spoke of her kindness and dreams. Viewers called radio shows, offering prayers and encouragement. For 2 weeks, the search dominated local headlines. Mark, exhausted but driven, gave interviews by day and scanned maps by night. He listened for any new lead, no matter how flimsy, but then interest drifted away. A plane crash in another state, a political scandal. A sports Victoriani big story pulled attention from Emily's case. Reporters stopped returning calls. Volunteers drifted back to their lives. The ranger station filed its final notes and closed the active search. Emily's name joined the long list of missing persons whose stories sank into the quiet pages of police archives. At home, Emily's parents sank into a routine of endless waiting. They lit a candle at dusk every evening, whispering her name into the flickering light. Birthdays and holidays passed in muted tones. Her mother stared at the door, as if Emily would walk in at any moment. Her father sat at the kitchen table, untouched coffee growing cold. The world carried on around them, but they remained trapped in the same moment. The morning Emily vanished, Mark refused to give up. He visited police stations, begged for new searches, and refused to accept defeat. His sister's laughter echoed in his mind, and he refused to let it fade. As he turned 25, he set aside a small room in his apartment for her things: a neatly folded uniform, her favorite books, the photograph of him on his college day. He spoke to her often, imagining her replies. Though grief lay heavy in his chest, his love burned brighter, guiding him toward one final decision: to bring someone new into the case who might see what others had missed. That hope came in the form of Detective Maria Alvarez, a retired state investigator known for solving long, cold cases. In the summer of 2005, she read Emily's file one night and noticed gaps in the timeline. No one had checked the old deer trail east of the runway, and the initial interview with the shuttle driver felt rushed. She reached out to Mark and offered her help. For the first time in years, Mark felt a spark of relief. With Alvarez on board, a fresh search could begin. As they sat together over maps and photos, Mark dared to believe that Emily's story was not yet over. And so the search that went cold flickered back to life. 15 years passed in a slow, heavy haze. Seasons came and went, and with each one, the world seemed to forget Emily Harper a little more, but her family never did. Every August, like clockwork, Mark, now in his mid-20s, drove north to the small park by Lake Union in Seattle, carried a single white flower in a lantern. As dusk fell, he lit the lantern and whispered a prayer for his sister. The soft glow of the light on the water reminded him of Emily's warm smile. He stayed until the lantern's flame grew small, and gathered it up and drove back home, the flower pressed between the pages of his journal. Emily's parents struggled with quiet grief. Her mother, Claire, kept Emily's room just as she had left it, her uniform pressed on a hanger, her books neatly stacked on the nightstand, the photo of Mark pinned on the wall. Claire would sit on the edge of the bed and fold Emily's scarves one by one, as if she could fold her daughter. Back into the world, at breakfast, she sometimes set a place at the table, half hoping Emily would walk through the door and slide into the chair. Her father, John, spent hours in his workshop, carving wooden airplanes. Each model carried Emily's name in tiny letters on its wing. He hoped that someday she would return to sign it. In those years, the police files lay untouched on dusty shelves. Few people asked about Emily anymore. Her case folder held faded maps, typed notes, and the single scrap of navy fabric found in the woods. No new evidence came in. Occasionally, a stranger wrote a letter to the Harper home, claiming to have seen her in another state or even another country. Claire and John saved every letter, though none proved true. They hung hope like ornaments on a bare tree, only to watch them fall one by one. Then, one evening in spring 2005, Mark read a news story about a detective who solved a 20-year-old case by spotting a missed clue. His heart raced. He remembered a conversation at the airport office in Anchorage. The driver had described a deer trail east of the runway that no one had searched. He remembered the torn uniform patch. He reached for his phone and typed a name he had seen in the news: Maria Alvarez. He wrote, "You helped solve cold cases. My sister vanished in 1992 near Anchorage. The case went cold. I believe there is more to find. Will you help me?" Detective Alvarez replied that very night. She asked for every scrap of information: police reports, photos, maps, even the letters. Mark spent days scanning the old files, typing them into digital formats, and sending them north. When he finally met Alvarez by video call, she had the steady gaze of someone who believed no mystery was too small. "We will treat this case as if it happened yesterday," she told him. Her voice carried both compassion and resolve. For the first time in years, Mark felt a spark of real hope. Alvarez flew to Seattle in June and drove with Mark north to Anchorage. They rented a small cabin near the airstrip where Emily had vanished. Inside, they spread maps across the table and pinned photographs on the walls. Alvarez pointed to the old deer trail on the eastern side of the field. "No one searched here," she said. "You mentioned footprints circling and returning. That makes me think Emily might have followed an animal path, turned around in confusion, and walked in circles." She studied the torn uniform piece. "This should tell us her final direction." Each day, Alvarez and Mark hiked through the same woods, tracing Emily's last known steps. They followed the narrow gravel road, then veered onto the deer trail. The underbrush scratched their legs, and moss clung to fallen logs. They paused at a small clearing where the sun dappled the ground. "Look," Alvarez said, pointing. Dents in the soil, faded but still there, formed a near-perfect circle. They knelt and photographed the marks. "She stood here," Alvarez whispered. They backtracked from the circle and found a shallow depression near a rock outcrop. The ground looked disturbed, as if someone had brushed aside leaves. Alvarez knelt and ran her fingers through the soft earth. "This could be a hiding spot or a moment of rest," she mused. She collected a few soil samples and placed them in a small bag. "Every detail matters," she said. Days they would send these samples for analysis, hoping to find trace minerals or pollen types that narrowed the timeline. Evenings brought long talks by a small campfire. Mark shared memories of Emily, her favorite cinnamon toast. The way she laughed when a child called her flight lady, her serious promise to send postcards from every stop. Alvarez listened and nodded. She talked of other cold case families who found closure, reminding Mark that hope and heartbreak often travel together. Under the starry Alaskan sky, they promised to find the truth, no matter how deep it lay buried. Back in Anchorage, whispers stirred in the small community. Old-timers who had once searched the woods noticed Alvarez's rented cabin and the steady flow of people coming and going. A retired forest ranger dropped by the local diner and asked about the newcomers digging in the East Trail. A shopkeeper saw footprints in the mud near the old road that did not belong to any of her records. Slowly, fresh memories surfaced, stories of a distant cry heard at night. Footprints found near a hidden stream, an old picnic table with fresh graffiti that had not been there before. No single story solved the puzzle, but together they formed a richer image. As the search expanded with Alvarez's direction, volunteers from the local search and rescue team joined in. Each brought new eyes and new energy. They combed the forest floor, using metal detectors to sweep near rocky outcrops. Drone pilots scanned the treetops from above. Every item found a blue bead. A faded hair tie was carefully cataloged. Slowly, the investigation reopened doors that had been long closed. Back at the cabin, Alvarez and Mark pored over each finding. They created a timeline that tracked Emily's last moments, leaving the plane, pausing at the clearing, heading toward the creek, then turning back. They mapped out distance covered, probable time spent in each spot, and possible reasons for her choices. "She might have followed the creek for water," Alvarez suggested. Then she saw a fallen tree and decided to rest. Night came too. Soon, she looked at Mark. But why not stay? I walked back toward the road. Mark considered this. She loved being seen. Maybe she thought rescuers would drive by. She moved toward the road for help. Alvarez nodded. That makes sense. So we should search a half-mile north of the runway road. They adjusted their maps and prepared for the next day. Final day of their expedition. As the sun rose over the spruce trees, they hiked beyond the usual search boundary. The ground here was softer, wetter. They carried quiet hope. At midday, Alvarez spotted something half-buried in moss near a rocky ridge, a small, dark shape. She crouched and brushed away leaves. It was a fragment of a flight attendant's lapel pin, the same style Emily wore. Her breath caught. She showed it to Mark, whose eyes filled with tears. It was the proof they needed, a direct link to Emily's path. They marked the spot with a small flag and radioed the team. Volunteers arrived and began careful excavation. They found another fragmented piece of Emily's notebook cover, its edges frayed. With each tiny find, the silent years seemed to crack open. For Mark, the moment felt surreal. He reached out and touched the lapel pin, its metal cold against his palm. He whispered, "I'm coming, Emily." That night, Alvarez and Mark sat by the fire, the air filled with the scent of pine smoke. They had found the first concrete evidence in 15 years. Search was not over, but the path had become clear. Mark folded Emily's last flight patch into a small box and hugged it to his chest. He looked at Alvarez, gratitude shining. In his eyes, "Thank you for not giving up," he said. Alvarez smiled gently. Emily's story demanded to be heard. We're just the ones listening now. In the silence of the Alaskan woods, hope stirred once more. The long years of waiting had brought them to this moment, though the years of silence weighed heavily on their hearts. The renewed search promised the answers they had hungered for all along Point 22. Rain came to the Alaska foothills in a dull roar the night before. The wind whipped through spruce and birch, bending trees until their branches scraped the earth. Down in the valley, the small airstrip lay quiet, its lights dimmed against the spray of water. Emily Harper's old crew shuttle office had long since closed. But the storm seemed to reach there, rattling windows and shaking doors as if it remembered someone lost. When dawn broke on June 12, 2007, the rain had not stopped. It fell in gray, sheets that blurred the world beyond a few feet. Detective Alvarez stood beside Mark at the edge of a muddy clearing. They had returned to Alaska after the lapel pin find, mapping every clue that Emily might have left behind. Now they stood before the steep slope where the old deer trail cut into the foothills. "The ground is soft," Alvarez said, testing. "The earth with her boot. All that rain could shift this whole face." Mark watched small rocks tumble down as if nudged by an unseen hand. Neither spoke of hope or fear. They simply waited, feeling the weight of years in their bones. At mid-morning, a sharp crack echoed through the trees. It sounded like metal bent to a breaking point. Then came a distant roar as water poured down the hillside, carving fresh ruts into the mud. Branches snapped, and stones clattered like deer hooves on a hard road. Mark felt his heart pound. "Watch out," he whispered. A wall of earth broke loose. Mud, roots, and shattered rock tumbled down the slope in a gray wave. Branches flew past like arrows. For a moment, Alvarez and Mark stepped back, hands thrown up to shield their faces. Then silence fell, broken only by the drip of water and the hiss of dirt sliding to a stop. When they crept forward, the scene was strange and new. Where there had been a smooth, moss-covered face of rock, now lay a jagged scar. At its base, the mud had cleared a shallow pit that glowed faintly in the damp morning light. Mark knelt and brushed grit from a hard surface, his breath caught. Detective look. Alvarez joined him and knelt too. Embedded in the mud, pressed into the rock, was a small rectangular shape. She leaned closer. It was Emily's official name badge, the one she wore on every flight. The thin metal shone dull but unmistakable. Below it lay a fragment of dark blue fabric. Mark gently picked it up. It was the torn edge of Emily's uniform jacket, matching exactly the scrap found years before. Tears blurred Mark's vision. He closed his eyes for a moment and felt the years of searching, hoping, and waiting slip from his shoulders like wet clothes. He opened his hand and let the badge rest in his palm. The letters E. Harper glinted faintly. "We need to call." "The team," Alvarez said softly. She stood and looked around the clearing. There may be more. Within an hour, searchers in rain jackets and rubber boots spread out below the slope. They used shovels and trowels, working in wet silence. Each small find, a broken earring, a glass bead, a chipped piece of a pen went into a numbered evidence bag. Mark walked slowly among the workers, his boots sinking into the thick mud. The air smelled of wet stone and fresh pine. It felt real, alive, as if Emily had just stepped through the trees a moment ago. At noon, one of the volunteers shouted and held up a small, flat object. Alvarez hurried over. It was a fragment of a lightweight notebook cover. The dark green plastic bore the faint imprint of a spiral binding. Emily had carried her notebook on every trip, filling it with flight codes, doodles, and heartfelt letters to Mark. This piece was stained with mud but still held its shape. This was hers, Mark whispered, voice thick. He brushed dirt from the edge and traced a finger over a faded swirl she had drawn in the margin. He remembered her laughter when she drew cartoons in the crew lounge, pretending the pens were dancing across the page. Now, that pen and paper lay half-buried in Alaskan soil, preserved by months of stillness and cold. Detective Alvarez gathered the team around and pointed to a small rise at the eastern edge of the clearing. "We should check that out next. The slide may have carried items from higher up." She scaled the wet incline, boots slipping slightly. Mark followed, holding a flashlight even though the day was bright. At the top, mud gave way to a cracked patch of bare rock. Embedded in a shallow crevice was a round, silver object. Alvarez knelt and pried it free with gloved fingers. It was a single, small, earring-plain, silver hoop, the kind Emily had always favored. She remembered Emily fastening them quickly in the mirror before morning flights. "The 3 pieces match her last known outfit," Alvarez said, her tone both factual and gentle. "Name badge, jacket, fragment earring. All here." She wiped them clean with a cloth and placed them in separate bags. Mark stood back and looked down the slope. The line where old earth met new was stark dark mud cutting through green moss. He thought of Emily stepping there, maybe curious about the view or searching for help. Then the land had given way beneath her, like a secret opening its mouth. They stayed until early afternoon, sifting through every inch of the landslide path. Each time the rain paused, a shaft of sun lit a fresh piece of evidence. Small stones rolled underfoot. Branches, stripped of leaves, angled toward the sky. By late afternoon, the team had filled a dozen evidence kits. They gathered in a circle at the clearing center. Alvarez read off each item and its location coordinates marked on the slope and on handheld GPS units. She then spoke to Mark. "This gives us a clear trail. We know exactly where Emily first fell. Next, we should trace backward, follow the slope to find her final resting place." Mark nodded, his whole being focused on the detective's words. He felt closer to his sister now than he ever had. The earth had given up its secret at last, and with it, a path through the years of uncertainty. As the sun sank low behind the spruce line, they packed their gear. The evidence kits rode in the back of a ground crew pickup. Alvarez and Mark climbed in the cab, soaked to the skin but alight with purpose. The radio crackled with the return of the final search team. Each voice spoke of weariness and hope. On the ride back to the field office, Mark held one small bag against his chest, the one containing Emily's name badge. He looked at Alvarez. "Thank you," he said, "for finding her, for believing." Alvarez placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Emily never stopped being here," she said, voice soft. "The land kept her story safe until we came back to listen." That night, at the small lodge by the airstrip, they laid out the items on a table under bright lamps. Forensic technicians in white coats photographed every angle. They labeled each piece: badge, fabric, earring, notebook fragment. Some items were still wet with mud. Others bore scratches deep enough to mark the passing of time. The lab wood, clean and preserve them, then study them for clues how far Emily had fallen. The angle of her slide in the final spot where she lay. Mark watched the lights blink on each camera. He felt a fierce gratitude that every piece of Emily's life had returned to him. He whispered to her absence, "I'm coming." And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the lodge was still and the only sound came from the wind in the pines, Mark and Alvarez reviewed the map again. Lines from the landslide cleared area led to a point higher on the slope. "That's where we search tomorrow," Alvarez said, tapping the map. "We'll find her remains. Then you can finally bring her home." Mark closed his eyes and imagined Emily's face, her gentle smile, the soft curve of her cheek. For the first time in 15 years, he felt a calm certainty. The land had revealed its secret in the roar of a landslide, and now Emily's story would move from fragments and mud to a full circle of peace. Outside the window, the wind had died down. Rain fell as a soft whisper. The pines swayed gently, as if in respect. In the hush of that Alaskan night, hope glowed brighter than any lamp. The search was far from over, but the hardest part had been done in covering the truth that lay buried beneath years of silence. And with that truth in hand, Mark and Detective Alvarez knew they would finish what nature had begun. Mark woke before sunrise, his heart heavy yet filled with purpose. The night's rain had cleared, leaving the air crisp and clear. He dressed quietly in the small cabin, careful not to wake Detective Alvarez. He pulled on his boots and stepped. Outside, the ground still damp from the storm. Above him, the sky glowed pale blue. Today would bring Emily home. They met in the clearing where the landslide had revealed her badge and earring. Forensic teams had spent the night preparing the site. Now early morning light shone on grid lines marked in the mud. Volunteers stood by with metal detectors and brushes. Each person carried hope on their shoulders. Mark felt a quiet hum of togetherness. This was a community determined to honor Emily's life. Alvarez approached with a map in her hand. "The remains should be just uphill from here," she said softly. Mark nodded, feeling a mix of calm and tension. He carried a small velvet box containing the badge, ready to keep it near his heart once the search was done. As they climbed the slope, each step felt like walking back through time. The path was steep and slippery, roots rising like old bones.
"Oh."
Mark gripped Alvarez's arm for balance. He remembered stories of Emily exploring wooded trails, her laughter echoing like bells. Now the forest held a solemn hush at the top. They found a shallow hollow beneath a rocky overhang. Volunteers gathered around as Alvarez knelt and parted. Layers of wet leaves. She called the team forward. A student volunteer brushed gently near the rock face and uncovered a human bone fragment. Mark's breath caught. He knelt beside Alvarez and watched as the team worked with care. They found more fragments, arm bones, a few ribs, and finally part of a skull. Each discovery was carefully photographed and lifted into evidence bags. Mark closed his eyes for a moment and whispered Emily's name. When all remains were collected, Alvarez placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "We'll confirm identification with the lab, but I'm certain it's her," she said. He nodded, tears filling his eyes. He felt relief wash over him like a gentle wave. After 15 years, he would know the truth of what happened to his sister. Back at the lodge, a forensic anthropologist examined the fragments under bright lights. The lab confirmed through dental records and the uniform badge that these were indeed Emily's remains. The team worked with quiet respect, wrapping each bone in soft cloth and placing them in a polished wooden box. Late afternoon, Mark held the box in his hands. It was heavier than he expected, as if carrying the weight of years. He felt Emily close, her spirit gentle and unwavering. He thought of her bright voice, the way she lit up a room. He breathed deeply and steadied himself. The next day, friends and volunteers gathered in a small clearing at Glacier Bay National Park. Late. June brought long days and dramatic light on the water. A granite cliff faced the gathering, and below, it lay the calm bay, smooth as glass. Mark stood at the edge, dressed in a dark suit that felt stiff and foreign. He held the wooden box and looked out over the water. Emily's parents, Claire and John, stood beside him. Claire wore a simple blue dress, the same color as the sky on that August morning when Emily vanished. John's eyes were red, but he straightened his shoulders. Friends and fellow flight crew formed a semicircle behind them. A soft breeze carried the scent of pine and salt. Mark opened the box and looked at his parents. "This is Emily," he said, voice steady. He told them how the landslide had revealed her badge and uniform, how the search team had found her remains uphill. He spoke of their courage, of every person who joined them. Tears shone in Claire's eyes as she reached for the box. A hand over hers, they stepped toward the edge and lifted the box together. Mark read the words his sister once wrote in her notebook. For Mark, who always believes. He held the box high and gently tipped it forward. Brown earth and bone slipped out, drifting in a soft plume. The wind caught the dust, lifting it into the sky like a whispered promise. Silence fell. Then a single seagull cried overhead. The water shimmered where the box had been. Friends whispered prayers, and Claire placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. In that moment, every tear felt like a release. Every breath felt like healing. After the scattering, a small bell rang 3 times, once for hope, once for loss, once for love. Then friends stepped forward to share memories. A fellow attendant spoke of Emily's kindness to a nervous child. Local ranger remembered finding her badge in the mud and feeling a pang of guilt that they had missed her. Each voice wove a tapestry of who Emily was. When it was over, Mark and his parents walked hand in hand down a narrow trail. Beyond the trees, whales broke the surface of the bay, sending sprays of water skyward. The world moved on, but their hearts carried Emily's memory forward. In the weeks that followed, the airline issued new safety guidelines. Every remote stop would now include personal GPS trackers for crew members. Flight crews attending small airstrips would have mandatory check-in protocols every 15 minutes. These changes came from Emily's story. A gift born of loss, but shining with the light of prevention. Mark returned to Seattle, founded the Emily Harper Search Foundation. He raised funds to provide emergency beacons for hikers and travelers. In remote areas, schools taught safety workshops using Emily's story as an example. Her name became a symbol of care and preparation. At home, Mark set up a small office filled with maps, search equipment, and photos of Emily. He kept her uniform patch in a glass frame on the wall. Every year on June 12th, he led a group search along the land where she vanished, ensuring that her story lived on. Volunteers handed out bracelets engraved with E, Harper, and phone numbers for emergency contacts. On the first anniversary of her scattering, Mark returned to Glacier Bay, alone. He walked to the spot and scattered fresh flowers over the bay. As petals floated on the tide, he spoke softly. "I miss you," he said, "but I will carry your light in everything I do." A breeze lifted his words and carried them across the water. Though Emily's life had been cut short in the wild Alaskan hills, her legacy grew strong. Every beacon sold, every safety guideline followed, every story told kept her spirit alive. Travelers carried her name in their hearts, and no remote trail felt as lonely. Each dawn, Mark looked at the framed badge on his wall. He remembered Emily's smile, her dream to make a difference one flight at a time, whispered thanks for the storm that revealed her, for the detective who would not give up, for every person who joined the search. Life moved forward in gentle rhythms. Mark taught at an aviation college, sharing stories of safety and compassion. He told students about Emily, how her kindness saved a child's fear, how her dedication led to lasting change. They listened, wide-eyed, and promised to honor her memory in their own flights, and sometimes, when a plane took off into the morning sky, Mark watched from the runway. He spotted a flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform, her hair tied back like Emily's. She smiled as she greeted a passenger. Mark closed his eyes and felt a warm breeze, as if his sister were there among the clouds. He whispered into the wind, "Fly safe, Em. I'll see you someday." In every takeoff, every beacon lit, every memory shared, Emily Harper's story lived on, and in the map of lives touched by her light, the world grew just a little safer, just a little kinder one. Flight, one search, one heart at a time.